High in the Carpathian Mountains, veiled by snowstorms and shadowed by pines older than any nation, there stood a monastery with no records, no visitors, and one unbreakable rule: never speak the name of God. Not in prayer, not in confession, not even in death. Those who joined were never seen again outside its stone walls. Those who disobeyed were never heard from again inside them. For over 400 years, this order thrived in isolation, silent, strict, and terrifyingly devout. The few surviving accounts speak of monks mutilating their own tongues in penance, of cryptic chants not in Latin, but in languages lost to time, and of a final ritual so disturbing it drove an entire village mad. This isn't a fable. The ruins still stand, and what happened within its walls may be one of the most forbidden religious experiments in European history. Because this wasn't worship. This was erasure of sound, of self, of sanctity. And it began with one whispered heresy: God's name is too sacred to ever be spoken. They came from every corner of a crumbling Europe, men of faith, fear, and desperation. Ex-priests, exiles, heretics. Some sought redemption, others anonymity. But all of them were drawn to a rumor that whispered through the backroads of 15th century Wallachia. There was a place where you could be closer to God by never speaking his name again. The founder was a man once known as Father André Vlas, a decorated scholar of Orthodox theology, fluent in 6 languages, and once revered by the church for his ascetic lifestyle. But in 1453, something changed. Following a failed pilgrimage to Mount Athos, André returned gaunt, silent, and trembling with visions. According to a tattered letter discovered centuries later, he claimed to have heard the true voice of God, not as sound, but as utter silence. He called it the wordless word. Vlas denounced scripture aloud in his final sermon, declaring all language corrupt, a fallen attempt to cage the divine in human noise. To name God, he warned, is to blaspheme him. And then he vanished. When he reappeared a year later, he was no longer a priest. He was an abbot, presiding over a small group of cloaked men on the fringe of the Busigi Mountains. No church sanctioned this. No land deed recorded it. But within weeks, walls began rising, stone by stone, without blueprint, without blessing. Locals called it the cloister of the unspoken, but its members simply called it the hollow monastery. From the very beginning, rules were absolute. No speaking after sundown. No written mention of any divine name. No chant, no psalm, no prayer spoken aloud. And above all, never utter the name of God. Not even in thought. It wasn't just silence. It was obliteration of the self. Vlas taught that ego was born from speech, and that salvation required the annihilation of the voice. The first few years were marked by extreme devotion and eerie transformation. Monks would go months without a single spoken word. Communication was done through crude hand signs or inkless gestures on parchment. New initiates were required to take a vow of permanent silence. If they broke it, they were taken to the stone cellar and returned changed. Some never returned at all. But what truly unsettled the nearby villagers wasn't the silence. It was the smiles. Men who once screamed during storms or wailed at funerals were now calmly, coldly still, eyes vacant, lips pressed in permanent contentment. Even as disease and famine swept through the region, the monks remained untouched, unbothered. Soon, legends spread that they had found divine protection, that their wordless devotion brought them closer to heaven, that their silence had called something else instead. Then, in 1460, a messenger from the church arrived with orders to dissolve the monastery. He left days later, raving, stripped of his robes, eyes gouged out, screaming just one phrase in Latin. Deus non tacet, sed vos tacitus. God does not stay silent, but you do. He died foaming at the mouth. After that, no one interfered again. But the hollow monastery had only just begun. At first glance, the hollow monastery resembled any remote religious refuge. High walls, modest stone cells, a central chapel, and a bell tower that never rang. But to step inside was to enter a different world. One not merely ruled by silence, but consumed by it. There were no hymns at sunrise. No sound of conversation at meals. Not even the echo of footsteps on the stone floors. For the monks wrapped their feet in layers of cloth to muffle the noise. Sound itself was treated like sin, and every effort was made to eliminate it. Even breathing was disciplined. Every brother of the hollow monastery followed a regimen known as the atonement of the mouth, a brutal 3-month rite during which they fasted to the edge of death, wore a metal bridle over their tongue during sleep, and endured repeated beatings for involuntary vocalizations like sneezing or coughing. The goal? To erase the habit of speech entirely. Initiates were stripped of their names and given only gestures, crude symbols etched onto bark, clay, or skin. Any object bearing written language was forbidden within the monastery, including the Bible. The Word of God, they taught, could not be read. It could only be experienced in absence. One defector, a novice who escaped after just 6 weeks, later described the chilling silence as like being buried alive in snow. He said the older monks would sit for hours in complete stillness, staring at a black wooden crucifix with no figure upon it. No Christ, no name, just a blank cross. It felt like they were trying to erase him, he said. Not to forget God, but to remove him entirely, as if he had never existed. And they took their rituals even further. Each week, the monks would gather for the procession of absence, a midnight walk through the chapel, each man holding a candle and walking in a precise formation, eyes closed, hands on the shoulders ahead of them. No one led. No one followed. They simply moved in silent circles until someone, without word or signal, stopped walking. Only then did the procession end. The silence was not peaceful. It was paralyzing. Over time, it began to break the men. Some fell into trances for days. Others harmed themselves to feel the presence of anything, even pain. The monastery responded by building new structures underground, soundless isolation cells carved directly into the mountain rock. There, monks who had broken the silence, by accident or intent, were locked away until they regained their purity. One was found dead in his cell with his fingernails clawed down to the bone, a single word scratched over and over into the stone floor: forgive. But what disturbed visitors most was what was missing from their daily practice. There were no sacraments, no Eucharist, no confession, no baptism. The spiritual lifeblood of Christian tradition was absent. Vlas taught that sacraments are screams dressed as rituals. God hears none of them. In his twisted theology, only silence could reach God, because only silence was untouched by human corruption. What Vlas had built was not a monastery. It was an auditory tomb, a place where faith wasn't spoken but buried. And then came the chasm rite. Every winter solstice, the monks gathered in the deepest part of the mountain, in a cave beneath the monastery known only as the Throat. There, blindfolded and barefoot, they stood for hours in freezing darkness, saying nothing, moving not an inch, until Vlas entered. Though the records are fragmented, all surviving accounts agree on one thing. Vlas would raise a knife and slice his palm open in silence, letting the blood fall onto the stone. One drop for each name of God he refused to speak. And then the others would follow. Dozens of monks, bleeding in darkness, never making a sound. One year, the blood froze to the stone in grotesque patterns resembling Hebrew letters. Another year, a monk died during the rite, his body contorted into what looked like a scream, mouth wide open, yet no sound had ever escaped. That was the year they stopped calling it a monastery and started calling it a heresy. They said it began with one monk, a man whose name had been erased, whose past was unknown, and whose silence was deeper than death. He had fasted for 40 days, spoken not a syllable in nearly a year, and slept upright in a pit of ash beneath the chapel floor. One morning, the others found him kneeling before the altar, eyes rolled back, his hands trembling with something between ecstasy and seizure. Blood ran down his chin. His mouth hung open, and in it, a gaping wound where his tongue had once been. At first, they thought it was punishment, that perhaps he had spoken, and the silence had punished him. But then more followed, voluntarily. Over the next 6 months, 7 monks cut out their own tongues. Not in protest, not in madness. In worship, they believed their tongues were the last barrier between them and divine purity, a fleshy curse that kept them tethered to sin. By removing them, they were making room for this sacred void to dwell within them. One even etched the phrase, Dominus nihil, the Lord is nothing, into his chest before the act. None of them died. None of them bled out. In fact, their wounds healed quickly. Too quickly, some whispered. And what came after was worse. The tongueless monks began to change. They would stare at others with unblinking eyes, mouths slightly agape, their bodies unnaturally still. When they moved, it was always in perfect silence, gliding more than walking. They stopped eating solid food. They stopped sleeping in beds. They no longer followed the gestures of communication used by the other brothers. They no longer needed to. Witnesses say they began communicating in ways that defied explanation, subtle tilts of the head, shared glances that felt like entire conversations. One monk claimed he heard one of them inside his mind, whispering not in words, but in absence, like something had crawled into his thoughts and started scraping them blank. He begged to be released from the monastery. He was never seen again. And then there were the fires. It began with small flickers, candles spontaneously extinguishing in the chapel during evening meditation. Then came strange heat surges in the dead of winter. One monk reported waking up with blistered hands despite no visible source of flame. Another saw one of the tongueless monks levitating inches off the ground, bathed in flickering heat waves, and yet there was no fire. What they called the tongues of fire were not literal flames. They were a presence, an invisible force that burned not the body, but the spirit. Some described it as a divine touch, others as hell's caress. Outside the monastery, locals began noticing unnatural things. Livestock refused to graze near the mountains. Birds flew in wide circles around the monastery spires. Trees near the outer wall began to rot, not from disease or frost, but from within, their trunks hollow and blackened like charcoal. One woman, a shepherd's daughter, claimed to see white shadows moving through the mist near the monastery grounds. She said they moved without shape, without voice, but with overwhelming grief, like the very land was mourning. Still, the church did nothing. Whether out of fear, bureaucracy, or quiet approval, no action was taken. But not everyone remained silent. A group of Dominican Inquisition scribes, rogue monks operating unofficially, traveled to the region in 1472. They brought with them records, relics, and one objective: to confront Vlas. Only one returned. His name was Brother Mateo, and he had lost both his eyes and tongue. Carved into his back were words in ancient Greek: "The name is death." He died 2 weeks later in a monastery far to the west, writing one final phrase over and over in trembling hand: "They are making something. They are making silence into a god." In the dim silence of the hollow monastery's archives, a room never lit by fire, only touched by moonlight, there existed a manuscript so forbidden, even the monks dared not look upon it directly. Wrapped in animal hide and stitched with iron wire, it was known not by name, but by gesture. 2 fingers held over closed lips, and then slowly drawn across the throat. It would come to be known centuries later as the Gospel of Absence. Unlike the canonical Gospels, it contained no stories, no parables, no mention of Christ, Mary, or the apostles. There was no crucifixion, no resurrection, no judgment. Instead, it offered something far more disturbing: a theology built not on presence, but erasure. The text, a mix of Latin, Coptic, and Proto-Slavic symbols, was cryptic, abstract, and obsessively repetitive. But its core message was clear: God was not being. God was not being. The divine was not a presence to worship, but a void to descend into. The first line read, "In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was swallowed." Who wrote it remains a mystery. Some believe it was authored by André Vlas himself in the monastery's early years. Others claim it was found, unearthed beneath the foundations, as if it had been waiting. One chilling theory, proposed by a 19th-century scholar who briefly possessed a copy before disappearing, was that the manuscript was written by no one, that it simply appeared. The teachings within were heretical by any standard. It claimed that naming God, in any language, was the first sin, that every holy text was a corruption, that creation itself was a mistake, a noise that shattered the perfect silence of the divine void. Most disturbingly, it taught that humanity's purpose was not salvation, but uncreation. Each ritual, each act of silence, each severed tongue was a step toward this, dissolving the self, the soul, the world, until nothing remained but the sacred absence. Hidden within the final pages was a liturgical diagram, not a map, but a sequence, a countdown. 10 concentric circles, each labeled with a symbol of negation: no name, no voice, no thought, no light, no breath, down to the final ring: no God. The diagram was accompanied by an unfinished incantation, just one line, repeated 12 times in ascending size. To forget God is to see him. The monks treated the book not as scripture, but as living doctrine. It was never read aloud. Instead, each brother was required to sit in the archive once a week, eyes open, unmoving, and absorb it. One monk reportedly gouged his eyes out after a session, claiming that the letters had begun to scream. Another began writing fragments of the gospel on the walls of his cell, his own blood as ink. When the other monks found him, he had torn the skin from his face in strips, smiling through the horror, whispering, barely audibly, "He is nothing, and he is everywhere." The presence of the gospel began to change the monastery itself. Cracks formed in the chapel walls, shaped like unnatural runes. The bell tower collapsed without cause. Visitors felt an overwhelming dread, not fear, but a pull, as though something ancient and voiceless was drawing them into itself. Then came the fifth silence, a term found only once, in the margins of the Gospel's final page. The monks believed it was the final stage of divine unity, a state where sound, identity, and even memory were erased. One by one, they began preparing. They fasted for weeks, burned their remaining writings, sealed the monastery gates. When spring came in 1475, a traveler passing through the mountains reported something terrifying: the entire monastery chanting, not in words, but in synchronized breath. Hundreds of men inhaling and exhaling in perfect unison. It was said the sound was so strange, so unnatural, it caused birds to fall dead from the sky. Then silence returned, and stayed, forever, because shortly after, a new inscription appeared in the monastery's inner sanctum, burned into the stone altar without flame, without chisel, without human hand. The fifth silence has begun. The hollow monastery had gone completely silent. No movement, no smoke, no visitors. By the late 1470s, it was a structure frozen in time, sealed behind its stone gates, hidden by mist and snow, and feared by all who lived near it. Villagers from the surrounding valleys avoided it, as one might avoid a cursed grave. But then, the whispers began. They started subtly. A shepherd grazing his flock a mile from the cliffs claimed he heard a voice call his name, not from the woods or the wind, but from the ground beneath his feet. A widow fetching water said she heard singing in the hills, though no birds flew and no choirs lived within 50 miles. Most terrifying of all was the blacksmith's boy, who returned from an errand near the monastery's forest line with his mouth sewn shut. Not crudely, but with surgical precision, 6 tiny stitches, perfectly spaced. He never spoke again. When the stitches were removed days later, the boy only pointed toward the monastery and wept. Whatever dwelled inside hadn't died. It had evolved. A traveling merchant, skeptical of the legends, made his way toward the monastery in 1478. He claimed to hear prayers as he approached, soft, melodic, distinctly human. Yet when he reached the gate, the voices stopped. He knocked, waited, then turned back. But as he descended the mountain, he began to hear something else. Not words, breathing. He turned to find no one behind him, but the breathing continued, soft, raspy, synchronized with his own. He ran. Weeks later, his journal was found outside a convent in Cebu. Its final page scribbled in frantic ink: "The walls have lungs. The walls have mouths. The silence is alive." Soon, rumors swelled that the monastery had become a vessel, not of God, but of something older. Something that needed silence not as reverence, but as nourishment. A surviving monk from a neighboring abbey claimed to have received a visitor in the dead of night. A man wrapped in gray robes, barefoot, bleeding from the eyes. He never spoke, but handed the monk a bundle, a wax-sealed scroll containing new pages from the Gospel of Absence. These new pages described something called the inverted liturgy, a practice where monks no longer emptied themselves in devotion, but became hosts for a divine anti-presence. They were no longer worshippers. They were vessels. The pages also referenced something chilling: the reversed Pentecost. Whereas the original Pentecost described the Holy Spirit descending upon the apostles, granting them the power to speak in tongues, the reversed Pentecost took that power away. not by force, but by consent. The monks were offering their minds, their speech, their entire identities as sacrifices, and the thing they offered it to had a name. It was never written fully, only hinted at through negative space, a sequence of missing letters surrounded by black ink, as though the parchment itself had swallowed it. Then came the knockings. Locals began hearing strange sounds at night, tapping, scraping, rhythmic patterns that echoed from deep within the stone of their homes. Always in threes, always under beds, or behind hearths, or from cellar walls, and always followed by silence. Too perfect, too complete. Children were born without cries. Cattle began to refuse sound, standing in fields with mouths open and no bellow. Entire flocks of birds vanished overnight. It was as though the monastery's silence was spreading, not as a metaphor, but as an infection, an ontological disease. Villagers began carving protective symbols into their doorframes. Some fled entirely, leaving behind homes, livestock, even family. They would rather face wolves and war than risk the spreading silence. And then, one final message. A hunter, while tracking game near the cliffs, found a patch of forest where no echo existed. He called out, nothing. Fired a musket, no reverberation. Not even the snap of twigs beneath his boots made sound. At the center was a stone slab, freshly placed. Etched into its face was a short inscription in Latin. Ut silentium fiat Deus. So that silence may become God. He never returned home. His coat was found years later, draped over the monastery's locked gates. The whispers had ended, because they no longer needed to whisper. In 1481, amidst growing whispers of heresy and divine abomination, the Vatican could no longer turn a blind eye to the hollow monastery. It had become too loud in its silence. People across Wallachia were abandoning the region. Priests in surrounding parishes refused to conduct mass within a 20-mile radius. Whole dioceses had declared the monastery cursed. Even within Rome, murmurs began that perhaps something had been unleashed. Not a heresy, not a cult, but a spiritual weapon. And so the church sent a man, Father Alonso de la Rua, a Jesuit scholar, polyglot, and veteran inquisitor, known for unraveling the blasphemies of hidden sects in Spain, Egypt, and the Balkans. He was brilliant, disciplined, incorruptible, and utterly unafraid of darkness. His mission was clear: infiltrate the monastery, document its practices, and if necessary, destroy it. He left on horseback in spring. He never returned. But part of him did. 6 months later, a monk from a Romanian monastery near Alba Iulia discovered a half-burned satchel on the forest outskirts. Inside were scorched pages from a journal, a silver crucifix snapped in half, and a small glass vial, filled with black ash and human teeth. The surviving pages were disturbing. Father Alonso's entries began like any travelogue, careful observations of the land, the architecture, the people. But then, a change. The sentences grew shorter, disjointed, paranoid, like the silence had begun unraveling his mind. They don't sleep. I watch them. Hours pass, they do not move. The tongues are not gone. They've been repurposed. He stood above me last night, hands behind his back. No footsteps. No breath. I never heard him come in. In one entry, Alonso described being invited into the chapel of erasure, a room reportedly reserved for only the highest initiates of the order. No windows. No altar. Just a single, obsidian mirror in the center. He stood before it for 33 minutes. What he saw changed everything. My reflection was silent, but not still. It mouthed something to me. My name. Over and over. And then, it opened its mouth and screamed. But I heard nothing. In the last complete entry, dated October 3rd, 1481, he wrote, "The silence is not absence. It is containment. A seal. We broke it. We shattered it by listening. This place is not a monastery. It's a womb. And it's ready to give birth." The following pages were torn, stained, and mostly illegible. But on the back of the final sheet was a symbol drawn in black wax, a circle split by a jagged vertical line. Later investigations would find this exact symbol carved into the base of the altar in the monastery's inner sanctum, an altar that, to this day, won't reflect in photographs. The church buried the report, quietly branded Father Alonso a heretic, claimed he died of plague. But others knew the truth. A quiet excommunication. an attempt to erase not just the man, but the knowledge he carried. Unbeknownst to the Vatican, though, Alonso had sent one letter before vanishing. It arrived at a Jesuit seminary in Venice 2 weeks after he entered the monastery. The letter was unsigned, written in a trembling hand, and soaked through with sweat and wax. It contained only one line: "Do not speak his name. Do not think it." The monks were right. And taped to the parchment, barely hanging on, was a single artifact, a human tongue, shriveled and blackened. It was still warm when it arrived. Beneath the hollow monastery, deeper than any known crypt or catacomb, there existed a chamber so secret, so sacred, that even most of the monks did not know it was real. They called it the chamber below, but never aloud. The name was shared only through gesture, a downward-pointed finger pressed against closed lips. Its existence was referenced only once in the Gospel of Absence, on a page stained with something darker than ink. And in the place beneath all places, where no sound has ever lived, he listens. For centuries, it was dismissed as myth, the ravings of terrified defectors, or fever dream theology. But in 1859, a team of Austrian explorers surveying abandoned monasteries across Eastern Europe found what they were not meant to find. Hidden beneath a crumbled floor of the chapel, behind a false wall and sealed with 7 waxen crosses, was a spiral stairway carved directly into the mountain rock. No light reached its base, and yet the men reported a strange glow emanating from below, not a flame or moonlight, but something like colorless fire. Only 2 dared descend. They returned 3 hours later, weeping, bleeding from their ears, unable to form coherent speech. One would later draw a series of concentric symbols on the floor of his cell, then gouge out his own eyes and tongue. The other scrawled one word into the dirt before leaping from a bell tower: empty. What lay below the hollow monastery was not a burial chamber. It was a void engineered into being. Historical records now suggest that André Vlas had commissioned its creation within the first 5 years of the monastery's founding. No one knows how it was constructed or what tools were used. It was deeper than the catacombs of Rome and colder than the crypts of Kiev. And it wasn't just carved out, it was built for something. The walls were perfectly smooth, designed not to echo. The air was thick but unmoving, like liquid glass. And at the chamber's center, illuminated by nothing, was a pedestal, obsidian black, featureless, and warm to the touch. Some believe it was an altar. Others say it was a mouth. The few remaining accounts from defected monks who claim to have seen it describe strange effects. Thoughts dissolving mid-sentence. Sudden memories vanishing. Voices inside their heads replaced by static. And a physical sensation of being unwritten, as though their soul was being slowly erased. Worse still, no sound could be made in the chamber. Not a whisper, not a footstep, not even the sound of one's own heartbeat. It was pure, perfect silence. Not natural silence. Not the silence of peace, but an active absence, like a hunger, devouring every trace of noise, identity, and meaning. One former monk, who escaped decades later and lived out his days in a Romanian asylum, spoke through crude drawings and gestures. He claimed the pedestal in the chamber was a sarcophagus, but not one holding a body. It held a name never meant to be heard, a name so holy or so monstrous that the monks built the entire monastery as a seal to contain it, not to protect the name, but to protect the world from it. The chamber below was the engine of it all, the source of their silence, the heartbeat of their theology. It wasn't just a place of worship. It was the reason for their existence. But then, something changed. By the early 1500s, the chamber began to influence the monastery above. Objects moved on their own. The laws of sound broke. Birds fell dead mid-flight when passing overhead. Children born nearby were silent, not mute, but seemingly unaware sound had ever existed. And most chillingly, the pedestal grew warm and began to pulse. A monk documented it in the margins of a now-lost manuscript. It beats like a heart. It calls us downward. The silence is waking. That year, a series of unexplained earthquakes shook the region, localized entirely around the monastery. No tectonic shifts, no volcanic activity, and yet, villagers reported that the mountains groaned in the night. It wasn't tectonic. It was the chamber breathing, and something beneath the hollow monastery was beginning to stir. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Hollow Monastery was no longer a monastery at all. It had become a ritual machine, a living temple of human silence, built to serve something other than God. Whatever spark of divine reverence once existed had long since withered. What remained was not devotion, but submission, a hierarchy of wordless men, operating not by prayer or reason, but by instinct and sacrifice. This was the era of the blood litany. The phrase first appeared in a fragment of correspondence between two Benedictine monks in Transylvania. One had caught wind of a rumor that the Hollow Monastery, once a silent refuge, had begun performing unspeakable rites involving bloodletting, not as penance, but as praise. Shortly after sending the letter, the monk was found dead in his cell, his mouth sewn shut with gold thread. Later fragments of the Gospel of Absence confirmed it. The monks had entered a new theological phase, one in which blood replaced speech, pain replaced prayer, and erasure replaced salvation. The ritual was simple. Once a month, under the new moon, the monks would descend into the chamber below. There, in total silence, they would perform a ceremony with no chants, no scripture, only blood drawn from their own tongues, lips, and throats. Each monk was required to give 7 cuts, each one symbolizing a name of God that they refused to speak. The cuts were made in precise sequences, recorded not in writing, but in scars. The body became the scripture. When they returned from the chamber, they were pale, trembling, but smiling. And different. Locals began to notice disturbing signs. Feral dogs would howl and collapse at the monastery walls. Milk would curdle in the buckets before it could be poured. Entire nights passed without a single sound in the surrounding forest. No wind, no animals, not even the crack of trees in the cold. Something was growing stronger. One winter, a peasant boy vanished from a village 3 miles away. The next day, a bundle appeared at the village gates, a shroud of black cloth soaked in blood. Inside was a child's tongue, wrapped in a scroll bearing a single Latin phrase burned into the parchment. Let the innocent begin the chant. After that, the blood litany changed. Children, animals, travelers. No one knows how many were taken, or whether they were taken alive. Some believe the monks never killed, that the sacrifices were not consumed, but unmade, their voices torn from the world like pages ripped from a book. By now, the monastery was said to have no doors, no windows, just walls of stone that seemed to shift and pulse, like they were breathing with every ritual. People swore the structure had grown taller, that its spires stretched higher into the sky each time blood was spilled in its name. And then came the night without sound. October 2nd, 1504. Every town within 30 miles reported the same thing. At precisely midnight, sound ceased. No horses whinnied. No fires crackled. Even human voices died in the throat. People opened their mouths and found nothing there, not even the sound of their own heartbeat. The phenomenon lasted 10 full minutes. One woman later wrote, "It was like the world had been put on pause, like God had turned his face, and the silence had taken his place." That was the night the monastery's chapel bell rang for the first time in over a century. But no one rang it. In fact, when a Vatican archivist visited the ruins 2 centuries later, he found no bell in the tower at all, only a hollow shaft lined with the bones of birds. What had rung that night, if not metal? Something else had begun speaking, not with words, not with breath, with blood. The monks were now merely vessels, silent, mutilated bodies whose faith had crossed a threshold. Their God no longer needed names, no longer required worship. He was becoming real through negation, through sacrifice, through the slow, deliberate destruction of sound itself. And what was born in the chamber below was not God, but something that once knew his name and forgot it. No one truly knows what happened on the final night. Some say the mountain itself revolted, that the earth cracked open beneath the monastery and swallowed it whole. Others whisper it wasn't a collapse at all, but a birth. What is known is this. On the night of December 21st, 1505, the winter solstice, the hollow monastery ceased to exist. No explosion, no fire, just a sound. A low, impossible hum, heard across hundreds of miles. Not like a horn or an earthquake, but more like an anti-sound, something deeper than vibration. Those who heard it said it felt like the sky pressed down against their skulls, like the bones of their ancestors were trying to scream through them. And then silence. Not just silence in the air, but in memory. People forgot. Villagers who once lived in its shadow couldn't remember its name. Priests burned sermons that referenced it, terrified of what they had written. Maps redrew themselves. Paths to the monastery disappeared. Trails once walked for centuries now ended in rock and mist. It was as though the hollow monastery had never been real. But it was. The first concrete evidence of its collapse came in 1612, when a group of Jesuit explorers, acting on a suppressed Vatican codex, attempted to find the ruins. What they discovered was a jagged, unnatural depression in the earth, hundreds of feet wide, carved into the mountain like a cauterized wound. No walls, no bones, no artifacts, just ash, and something far more chilling. The pedestal from the chamber below, exposed to open air for the first time in centuries. It was still warm. Worse, the pedestal was cracked down the center, like something inside had broken free. Around it were symbols etched into the stone, not by human hands, but seemingly by heat or force. One symbol repeated 12 times. The jagged circle split down the center. The seal of erasure. The explorers took samples, photographs, but within a month, every one of them was either dead or institutionalized. One walked into the Danube and never resurfaced. Another bit out his own tongue in a crowded cathedral, then carved the word "listen" into his chest with a communion knife. The Vatican locked away all documentation, classified the site as terra damnata, forbidden land. But rumors continued. Hikers went missing. Radio signals from the area scrambled violently. Pilgrims heard strange breathing in the wind. And the land itself refused to heal. Trees wouldn't grow near the crater. Snow melted around it in perfect circles. Birds avoided it. No animal set foot near its edge. In 1745, a surveyor camped near the site for one night and went deaf by morning. He later said, "The silence was screaming." In 1871, a Russian linguist studying forbidden monastic texts uncovered something he shouldn't have: a final passage of the Gospel of Absence, buried within a coded appendix. Translated crudely, it read, "On the final night, when all names are gone, and the last breath is not taken but given, the unworded one will rise. He will not speak. He will not move. He will only listen, and the world will end, not in fire, but in silence." The linguist went mad. His last act was to blind himself, and sew his lips shut. Since then, few have dared revisit the site. Some who do claim to feel watched, not by eyes, but by absence, as though the silence is aware, alive, waiting. Others say they've heard it, a faint hum, below the threshold of human hearing, vibrating deep in the gut, not a sound, but a reminder that something was once sealed here, and that silence was once a choice. Now, it's an inheritance. Centuries have passed since the hollow monastery vanished beneath the earth, yet its legacy haunts history like a whisper carried on a cold wind. The silence at birth did not end with the collapse. It spread, infecting minds, places, and even time itself. Across Europe, scattered fragments of the Gospel of Absence continue to surface, each discovery darker than the last. Scholars who attempt to study these texts report nightmares of blank pages, voices calling their names in silence, and a creeping dread that erases hope. More chilling are the stories passed down through generations, of places where no bird sings, where children are born mute, and where entire villages have been abandoned after a silence fell over the land like a shroud. The hollow monastery's silence is not just absence of sound. It is a presence, a void that listens, a void that waits. And in the deepest shadows of folklore, some whisper a final truth. The silence was never meant to protect God. It was meant to protect us from what happens when silence becomes a god itself. The unworded one, an entity born from erased names and lost prayers, still lingers in the world's edges. Not as a deity, but as a judge, a witness, and an echo of all the words humanity has ever swallowed. Every forbidden name, every unsaid prayer, every vow of silence across history is a thread in its web, and it waits patiently for the moment when silence is no longer a choice, but a command. Because when the world finally answers the unworded one's call, there will be no voices left to scream, only the eternal sound of nothingness. The story of the Hollow Monastery is a warning that sometimes the deepest faith is not found in words spoken, but in the terrifying power of words forever unspoken. If this story unsettled you or left you questioning what silence really means, I invite you to subscribe for more journeys into the darkest, strangest corners of history. Share your thoughts below. What would you sacrifice to hear the unworded one? And don't miss our next video, where we explore another forbidden secret lurking just beneath the surface of the past. Remember, sometimes silence is louder than any scream.